Hi, this is Peter Dorman. Today's topic is market failure. This is the critical topic for economic policy from the vantage point of mainstream economics. So let's get started. Recall the market welfare model from before. This is a way of thinking about the positive and normative aspects of markets together. That is, how markets do work, and then also how you believe markets should work if you accept certain assumptions. The three conditions for this model to apply are, first of all, that the supply curve should represent the marginal cost to society of whatever action is being analyzed. The demand curve should represent the marginal benefits to society. And finally, that the overall model of two curves crossing at one point should fit. We will discuss later the question of the curve crossing equilibrium. That will come in a later lecture. But for now, today we're going to be looking at the first two conditions, the supply curve condition and the demand curve condition. If those conditions are all met, the two results of the model are, first, that the market equilibrium would also be the level of production and consumption at which net benefits to society were maximized, and second, that the market price would equal the marginal or incremental cost to society of producing one more good, and also the benefit to society of producing one more good if you accept that cost and benefit framework. The way it looks visually is in this diagram. So if you accept the notion that the demand curve represents marginal benefits to society, the supply curve of the marginal cost to society, that's the MB and MC on the diagram, then the shaded area, that yellow region, represents net benefits to society. In other words, it represents benefits as measured by the demand curve that are over and above the costs as measured by the supply curve. Q star, the market equilibrium, is the level of production at which society would get all the potential net benefits and none of the potential net costs. But what happens if the conditions don't hold? If they don't hold, economists call this a quote-unquote market failure. Now, it's important to recognize that a market failure, or that term, doesn't mean that the market, quote-unquote, doesn't work or would break down. The market could work just fine. People could be buying and selling. There could be some kind of equilibrium in the market. What the term market failure means is that the normative analysis, the market welfare model, breaks down. So those two happy conclusions, that the right level of production is obtained and that the information generated by the market price is the right information, that those two properties would be the ones that suffer. From the standpoint of mainstream economics, this is a disaster. This means the markets are not doing the job that we want them to do, and therefore there's a need for some type of intervention, a policy of some sort to fix this problem. The purpose of the intervention should be to restore as much as possible the initial conditions of the market welfare model which had been violated. We'll see how this is done with three different types of market failures. The first, monopoly; the second, public goods; and finally, externalities. It should be mentioned that there are other types of market failure as well. We're not going to cover them here. So let's start with monopoly. We often use in everyday speech the term monopoly or monopolistic to simply mean big, like a big corporation is a big monopoly. But this is not how economists use the term. From the standpoint of economics, the key characteristic of monopoly is the lack of competition. Literally, the word monopoly means a single seller, one particular seller that has the entire market. However, in addition to that type of situation, monopoly would not be a problem unless there were also some sort of barrier to entry of new competitors. Because even if there were a single seller, nevertheless, if there were no barriers to entry, new firms could come in and there was nothing the monopolist could do about that. It wouldn't have any social consequences. So barriers to entry are important as well as simply the existence of a single monopolistic seller. Our strategy will be to first consider a pure monopoly situation. one seller has the whole market, and then to think of an in-between situation or a range of in-between situations between competition and monopoly based on factors that tell us the degree of monopoly that we would encounter. What are the main barriers to entry? One of the most important is the law itself. So governments often set up laws that restrict the entry of new competition. The most important of these is the patent system. The patent system sets up what are called patent monopolies. If you have a patent on something, you own it, and you're the only one authorized to sell the product based on that patent unless somebody else licenses it from you, in which case they have to pay you for that right. But there are others as well. Intimidation, the threat of violence, is important, particularly in underground or illegal markets. Think of the market in illegal drugs, where the threat of shooting somebody could be what keeps them out of the market. That's clearly a major barrier to entry. Economies of scale sometimes provide barriers to entry, where in order to operate efficiently, you have to be very large relative to the size of the market, and there isn't room for perhaps more than one such firm to supply the market. This is what economists call the problem of so-called natural monopoly. Product differentiation can create barriers to entry. This happens through branding. If you can convince the consumer that your product is different enough from other products, well, then you're a monopolist in your own product. Nobody else can produce it because it's your brand. Scarce inputs are another source of market, or barriers to entry, rather. The most important of these is highly skilled labor. So you could imagine, for instance, a professional sports team or a legal firm that had high-powered lawyers where it was difficult for others to compete because they didn't have access to the same talent pool. If the talent pool is limited, that can be a source of monopoly power. Similarly, if there's a particular natural resource which is indispensable for the production of something, and there's a particular company that monopolizes that resource, then they monopolize the product as well. The final and very important in the modern world source of barriers to entry is what economists call network effects. This is a situation where the more people who use a particular product, the more value that product has. So in the case of computer software, for instance, the more people who use a particular piece of software or a computer platform, the more valuable that software or platform is to everybody else. So you can get a situation where a very large number of users have climbed aboard a particular platform, and it's difficult for anybody else to compete. There is a tendency in the digital marketplace for one or a very small number of firms to dominate most of these product areas. Here's now where we're going to look at pure monopoly and what its effect is. And the classic way to do this is through a diagram. So what we see in this diagram is a supply and demand situation, but with some special assumptions. The first assumption, just to make things easy, is we'll assume that the cost curve is perfectly flat. So it intersects the vertical axis at point C. That's the cost of production. And we'll assume it's the same cost of production at any level of quantity. So rather than being a rising or upward sloping curve, it's a perfectly flat curve. That makes life easy. We also have a demand curve. That's the average revenue curve that you see also in that diagram. But with that curve comes a marginal revenue curve. The marginal revenue curve is the change in total revenue that comes from a change in how much you sell. And it's a much steeper curve than the demand curve because as you change the price, it affects not only the individual unit you're selling, but all the units you've sold. The strategy for a monopolist is to set the level of output where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. That is, the additional revenue they get from that last unit of output is exactly equal to the additional cost to them of supplying that unit of output. The reason it's profit maximizing is that it includes every unit below that level for which there is profit to be made, where the revenue exceeds the cost. That point, that level of production on this diagram is Q star down on the bottom. So Q star is where the marginal revenue curve intersects the marginal cost curve. That tells you the quantity. However, it doesn't tell you the price. To get the price, you go up to the demand curve, because the demand curve tells you how much people are willing to pay to buy that quantity. So that brings you up to P star on the vertical axis. Now, when you have P star instead of C, the original cost, what's happened is that the price has risen above the cost. And when you have Q star below QC in the diagram, it means that the monopolist is restricting the supply of whatever good we're talking about in order to jack up the price. So the quantity produced in the market and goes down and the price goes up. And then what you see then is that purple rectangle, which represents extra profit due to having a monopoly. It's the additional profit per unit, so that's the price minus the cost, so that's P star minus C, that vertical distance, times the quantity of how many units you have, which is Q star. So the area of a rectangle is the product of the two sides. One side of the rectangle is the level of production, Q star. The other side of the rectangle is the excess of the selling price, P star, over the cost, C. That gives you that profit area. That represents monopoly profit. It's monopoly profit that's available to the monopolist because, since they can control the market, they can simply reduce how much they produce and jack up the price. It's extremely important to notice that this monopoly effect depends entirely on the elasticity of demand. So in the left panel, you see a situation with elastic demand. By elastic demand, we're talking about a demand curve that's relatively flat. So very small changes in price lead to big changes in how much consumers are willing to buy. That's a situation where monopolists don't have a lot of leeway to raise their price, because if they raise the price just a little, consumers are going to buy a whole lot less. That's a limitation on monopoly power. On the right-hand side, on the other hand, you have inelastic demand, where the demand curve is fairly steep, indicating that you could raise the price substantially and it would have only a relatively small effect on the amount people are willing to buy. In that situation, it's possible for monopolists to engage in their price gouging to a much greater extent and get a lot more profit. The elasticity of demand, in turn, depends on the availability of substitutes. So monopoly is particularly a problem in markets where there aren't close substitutes for the product the monopoly is selling. This could be either because it's a necessity, for which there isn't much of a substitute. Think water. If you have a monopoly over a local water supply, it's a great position to be in. If you're the monopolist, you can raise the price of water and people will continue to buy it from you because they need to. Similarly, the kinds of computer products we talked about earlier, the software and software platforms that have tended to be monopolized by one or a small number of companies, while these are not necessities, nevertheless, it's often difficult to get close substitutes. People are forced to use certain types of software because of work or because of communicating with friends and family. So in that situation, they simply pay the extra money and continue to use the software. Great for the monopolists. If we sum up the consequences of having monopoly power in this fashion, the first is that the price no longer tells us the information that it theoretically is supposed to in a competitive market. That is, the price is not equal to the marginal cost of production. That's significant information. Of course, the quantity produced is cut back below the level that we would have seen in a competitive market. It's a minor point, but technically interesting. There's no supply curve in a monopolistic market because the amount supplied is really a function of the demand. It's not an independent factor. Consumer surplus This is huge. Consumer surplus, which is the extra benefit consumers get over and above the price they pay, is much less in a monopoly, and much of that difference is transferred to producers in the form of extra monopoly profit. So it represents a gain of the monopolist at the expense of the consumer. One interesting question that economists have asked is whether monopoly is bad for innovation, for developing new products and new methods, or for variety, getting a variety of different products that consumers can choose among. So for instance, does a monopolistic software producer provide a nice variety of software? People who like different interfaces and so on, different functionality can pick what they want. There's a lot of disagreement about that. The answer appears to be mixed. Now let's consider the case of in between. So not perfect monopoly, but not also highly competitive. In the in-between case, we have something called oligopoly. Oligopoly means there are several firms that are selling goods, but not that many. So it's restricted competition. The degree of monopoly depends on, first of all, how much concentration there is among these oligopolists. Is there one particular firm within the oligopoly that has a big share and can kind of push the other firms to go along with it? That would be a dominant firm. Of course, another question is how much of the total output is concentrated within the oligopoly itself. And finally, are the conditions in the market favorable to the oligopolists cutting deals amongst themselves to kind of conspire against the public? These are important questions because oligopoly is actually the norm in most consumer markets. Rarely do we find a situation where there are vast numbers of independent sellers, all small relative to the size of the market. The more normal situation is a small number of sellers in between the situation of pure competition and monopoly. What can be done if observers feel that a market is becoming monopolized? That's the area that gets called competition policy. And there are a variety of different methods that can be used. Of course, very important is to have proper surveillance over the market to gather data on how much of the market is being concentrated into a few producers. Is there a dominant producer? Is there a tendency for them to all raise or lower their price at the same time and in the same way? So gathering data is the first step. A particularly contentious issue is the regulation of mergers and acquisitions. So often companies that theoretically are competing with each other wish to merge and become bigger. That reduces the number of firms competing in the market. And in principle, governments are in a position to approve or deny permission for those competitors to merge. Whenever that situation arises, it's usually a big fight between the power of government and the power of private corporations. Another approach that can be taken is to break up monopolies. If a single firm gets to be too large, the government can say you have to split up and become smaller firms. This has been used historically in the United States. The Standard Oil monopoly of John D. Rockefeller was split up. The Bell telephone monopoly was split up into the so-called baby bells, different regional telephone companies. The government tried to split up Microsoft and failed. Microsoft won that one, but the idea was to break up Microsoft into several separate units rather than let it continue as one big firm. So breaking up a monopoly is one possibility. Another is you can allow a monopoly to continue, but you can regulate it. And we allow this in many cases for public utilities. The regulation is sometimes rather toothless. Other times the regulation is fairly strong. In the United States, it's fairly normal for electricity to be provided by regulated monopolies. Cable in most jurisdictions is a regulated monopoly. So we do have regulated monopolies on a quite widespread basis in the US, maybe more than you see in other capitalist countries. Finally, the government, as an option, can just say, look, if it's going to be a monopoly, let's make it a public monopoly. So install a public producer to enjoy that monopoly position rather than a private producer. That way, it's more directly possible to control the behavior of the monopolist because it belongs to the public. But of course, it comes with its own set of problems. What happens if the public monopoly is unresponsive? What choice do consumers have? Enough about monopoly. Market failure number 2 is public goods. As is often the case in economics, it seems, this is an area where common use of language differs from the way economists use the language. In everyday speech, when we think of public goods, we think of goods provided by the government. The government's the public sector, right? So a public good should be a government good. Well, no, not in economics. In economics, a good that is provided by the government does not have to be a public good, and a good which is a public good does not have to be provided by the government. So there's no necessary relationship between the two. On the contrary, the definition of a public good in economics is that it's something that has one or both of two characteristics. The first is the non-exclusion characteristic. The second, non-rivalry. Non-exclusion means it's impractical to deny access to the good to those who haven't paid for it. Non-rivalry means there's no incremental cost to having one more user of that good. I'll talk a little bit more about each of these in a moment. It is a tendency of economists to think of these as natural characteristics that are just given by the technology of the good itself. It's not something that's caused by public action. And therefore, there's really not much you can do about, unlike competition, for instance, monopoly, which you can try to prevent monopoly, you can't prevent, according to most economists, a public good situation. All you can do is try to remedy it with the proper policy. So let's look at the first of these principles, non-exclusion. Non-exclusion matters because in most goods, if you don't pay for it, you don't get it. So if you go up to the cash register in a store with a pair of blue jeans in your hand and you say, I don't feel like paying for it, the store says, well, sorry, you can't walk out with the blue jeans. That's called shoplifting. We'll call the police and you'll be in trouble. And so it's a problem for you. You can't do it. Because of the prohibition on shoplifting, or in general, the prohibition of taking something that you don't pay for, that's how markets work. Markets can work because people are made to pay for things that they want to get. But what happens if you have a non-exclusion situation where even if you don't pay, you get it anyway? So here's an example. Take the case of weather forecasting. As long as the government provides weather forecasting services to one people, it can't really deny that to other people very easily. If the forecast is out there, people are going to hear about it. And so even if they haven't paid their weather forecasting fee, a friend of theirs will say, it's going to snow tomorrow, and they've gotten the information for free. Now, if you have a situation like that, there's going to be a tendency for people to say, well, that's great, why pay? I'll just get the service and I won't pay for it. That's called the free rider problem. If you rely on markets to distribute goods, and if you have a free rider problem where people get the good if they don't pay for it, that actually is a market failure. That market won't even arise. You won't get a market in that good because nobody will pay anything for it. That's a problem. The other problem is the problem of non-rivalry. Non-rivalry in sort of slightly more understandable terms means zero marginal cost. Now, most goods have a positive marginal cost. That means that if you're providing that good for one more person, you're going to have to pay a cost to produce it and get it to that person. So there's a cost involved, and people can be charged for the cost. Ideally, according to the market welfare model, you compare that marginal cost to the marginal benefit. So if the marginal cost of providing another unit of whatever it is more than the marginal benefit, don't do it. If the marginal benefit is more than the marginal cost, then you do it. And that's how the market welfare model is supposed to work. But what happens if the marginal cost is zero? Now, a common example of that is digital content. So music and movies and games and books and things that are distributed online digitally, there's essentially a zero cost for providing another copy of that content to another person. There was an initial cost in the beginning for somebody to create that content, but there's no marginal cost for another person or 20th person or 20 millionth person to get that same content. So you've got zero marginal cost. Well, in that case, of course, the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost for pretty much everyone. I mean, you need to have only a tiny little interest in a bit of music to have a benefit that isn't that's greater than the cost of disseminating it, since the cost of disseminating it is zero. So in that situation, you've got a price paradox. If you set the price at zero, because there's no cost, so logically you shouldn't charge people for it, then the fixed cost, the original production of that content, can't be financed. Nobody's getting paid for producing that song. On the other hand, if you do charge a cost for it, then you face the problem that you're pricing people out of the market when in fact there's no extra cost for them to use it. So either way, it's crazy and it doesn't work. What do you do about this? The general solution, which economists tend to support, is the idea of public provision financed by taxes. The tax solves the free rider problem. So it's true that you can't charge people per use because they get to use it anyway, so just make them pay a tax. If you make them pay a tax, you financed it. Meanwhile, if you distribute it for free, you're solving the zero marginal cost or non-rivalry problem because you're giving it away for free, and therefore anybody who gets any benefit at all from it can use it. In theory, it sounds great, and in fact, we do use this for a number of public goods purposes. To go back to the issue of forecasting, that's how the US government does it. The taxpayer pays for weather forecasting through NOAA, and the forecasting service is provided for free to the public. Nevertheless, while in theory it answers the questions that we would pose to it, it does come with some problems. It doesn't answer the question of how much we should spend to provide this service, a little bit or a lot. Do we do a lot of the service? What the quality of the service should be? And it doesn't help us prioritize because, after all, there are many, many public goods in society. We probably can't afford to finance all of them for free. We have to make some choices, and therefore we need some basis for making a choice. So the solution, quote unquote, to public goods doesn't answer all the questions, but at least it opens a door to thinking through what a policy should look like. The third externality, third market failure is externalities. This one in practice is extremely important. When you think about markets, what happens on a day-to-day basis is that people who might benefit from goods, the consumers, have to pay for the goods and services they might benefit from. That happens in a market. Producers, on the other hand, are imposing some costs on people. If they're workers, they're making the workers work. If they're using resources, that's a cost as well, because those resources might be limited or they might have some other use that they could be put to. So there are costs out there and there are benefits. And so we have markets where people are paying for things. And in theory, it should all come out in some reasonable way. That's the market welfare model. So if you really accept the logic of the market welfare model, it actually optimizes in the sense of producing the goods that people want and minimizing the cost of producing them. The big question, however, arises, what happens if you've got benefits and or costs, but no markets? No markets in these things. This is the problem of externalities. The definition of an externality in economics is a missing market. So let's consider two types of externalities. First, let's consider negative externalities. Negative externalities are costs, at real cost to society. So burdens that people have to bear, but they're not paid for. Nobody pays for these costs because there's no market in them. So a big example, the biggest of all, is climate change. Climate change is an enormous burden on ourselves and especially on future generations. It's going to be unmeasurably catastrophically costly to us, very costly. Nevertheless, there is no market in carbon emissions. People don't have to pay if they emit carbon. So there's no market in something which is actually imposing a huge social cost. There is, in economic terms, a missing market. The result of that is that we have a big environmental problem with climate change, and economists like to think that if we did have a market, or if at least we made people pay the real cost of what their carbon emissions are doing, there would be a lot fewer carbon emissions, and that would ameliorate or solve the problem. So the standard economic solution is to create the market that's missing by pricing the carbon emissions. And so they like to calculate, economists like to calculate what they think the correct cost of carbon emissions should be, and then impose that as a tax. A positive externality is the flip side of this. This is where you have a benefit, but it's not paid for. So somebody's getting a benefit, nobody's being paid, and that too is a problem. Consider the case of wetlands. Wetlands are very advantageous to the environment. They perform a lot of environmental services. However, the people who own land that the wetlands either are situated on or could be situated on don't receive any income. They're not paid for the use of that land for wetlands. And of course, there are costs to having a wetland. It means you can't build a house that you might sell to somebody, or you can't grow a crop that you might sell. So there are financial costs, but there's no benefit to leaving the land in the form of a wetland because nobody's paying you for that. It's a missing market. So the idea of standard economic analysis is that if you could figure out what the value of wetlands was on a money basis, and then you paid that money to landowners, they would have the proper financial incentive to preserve or build wetlands. Unfortunately, we don't have such a market. It's a missing market, but the economic solution is you could pay somebody to do it. If we look at these types of arguments in pictures, on the left side, we see an example of positive externalities where the marginal social benefit curve in blue is above and to the right of the private benefits that people have to pay for. So the social benefit curve includes benefits that people are not paying for. The market, left to its own devices, would be at Q1. At Q1, that's where supply equals demand, where we have a flat supply curve, MC again, use that device. So we would have Q1, but Q1 is not efficient because at Q2, all the units produced between Q1 and Q2 have net benefits because the marginal social benefit curve tells us what the benefit is, the cost curve tells us what the cost is, and between Q1 and Q2, the benefit curve is above the cost curve. So we would be foregoing those benefits by just having an unreformed market equilibrium at Q1. On the right-hand side, we see negative externalities where the social benefit curve is actually below what the demand curve or the marginal private benefit curve. And in that case, at the market equilibrium of Q2, we're producing too much. And we have a lot of net costs, that is, costs of production that were greater than the benefits that we get from stuff, and we should be back down there at Q1. So if there were some way of fixing it, you would want to reduce the amount of production of something that had a negative externality associated with it. To conclude this discussion, let's consider briefly the issue of the politics of market failure. Market failure theory is the practical application of the market welfare model. The market welfare model is based on certain assumptions about how we should think about the world. We should think of it in terms of benefits and costs, and that those have very specific definitions in economics and can be given monetary measurements. And the purpose of running the economy is to maximize the total amount of benefits in money terms over the total amount of costs in money terms. If you accept that framework, you would nevertheless have to agree that in many cases, markets left to their own devices will not do a good job of maximizing net benefits to society because of the existence of market failure. So most of economics is about what to do in the case of market failure. That's the underlying justification for all the policies that economists try to come up with in healthcare and education and environmental regulation, et cetera, et cetera. They perceive problems because of market failures, but the market failure framework also gives them a particular strategy for how to respond to the problem, to try to recreate in some way what would have occurred if markets had worked in what they think was the optimal way. To put it all together then, this represents essentially the neoliberal vision of economic policy. It is a case for activism. It's definitely a case for intervening in the environment and health and in many other areas of economic and social policy, but it's intervening, first of all, because there was a recognized market failure, and secondly, it's intervening in a way which, according to the theory of market failure, does the best job of restoring or creating the conditions that would have obtained if there hadn't been a market failure. That's the basis of its neoliberalism. Conservatives, free market conservatives, are often uncomfortable with this activism. They have two main responses that they can make. The first is they can say, well, yeah, there are market failures, but they're not that bad. So they can try to minimize the extent of the market failure. Climate change is really less costly than you think it is. Or, the lack of education for low-income people is really not as costly as you think it is. They can downplay the costs and make that case. But the main way in which conservatives try to rebut the argument for activism for market failure is to propose, yes, there's market failure, but there's also government failure. And you have to balance the two. And governments, they say, typically screw up, and the cure is worse than the disease. And so even though we recognize the existence of a market failure and uncorrected externalities and public goods and monopoly and all the rest, it's better not to do anything about it because the government will just make matters worse. That's a standard response on the part of free market types. It would be incomplete if I didn't also add that there is a third alternative, which is to try to justify economic and social policy on the basis of other types of goals which are not intrinsically economic as economists define them. So justify environmental policy on environmental grounds, or health policy on health grounds, education policy on cultural grounds, etc. And then just seeing economics instrumentally as a way to achieve goals that are defined and understood in terms of other values. Those three approaches, the market welfare model / market failure approach, the conservative free market approach, emphasizing government failure, and the follow other values approach, are, largely speaking, the three different ways that are available to us to respond to economic issues.